that is in hands of various project owners, or independence of journalism is a self-sufficient value that we should be talking about.
Let's start with the word freedom. Let's think about it. This word is perceived completely differently depending on the approaches you use. When Soviet Union was still there, the word freedom meant freedom from exploitation of man by man. You couldn't speak about an advantage of capitalist regime. In the West, it meant the right of any man to choose the value platform. And for that sense, any follower of the Biblian system, whether he's a Christian, Jew, or Muslim, by definition are not free. So what we can say, Maxim, you mentioned the term global projects. Any global project forms, first of all, its own language in which it forms the system of values. And all the press, irrespective of its intellectualism or lack of that, writes in that language. And if the language does not have corresponding notions, you simply cannot describe them. Thereby, your media becomes not free in an overall human sense. Just objectively, I can give you a very simple example. I'm very often asked, how come modern Western science and media are not just incapable of explaining the reason for the current economic crisis, and are even incapable of describing the concept we have today? The reason is very simple. That concept is based on capitalism of economic development is having depleted itself. In the Western system, there is no notion of end of capitalism. That theme is taboo. Day on day, newspapers and all media tell us the same thing. The crisis will be over tomorrow, and you need to understand that when the Western media writes about Syria, it derives from a language of description of the world. While we have in power people who stand for the biblical system of values, they are dictators, period. And as soon as you understand that, then you can very clearly read what exactly they write. A similar situation exists from other perspectives as well. For us, for living in what's called Eurasian territories, in the last 3-4 years, there's a lot more independent media, because the ideas of the creation of this Eurasian area, of which President Nazarbayev spoke back 15 years ago, they're now actually becoming objective, and immediately new language is emerging, and there are people promoting that language, that vocabulary. And I think to talk about freedom in media, of media, you must have first access to different sources of information that describe the situation in different verbatim, and then you can discuss about getting any objective information. Thank you. I still didn't get why you need to get objective information, but Mr. Salmawi, the experience of the Arab world is very much interesting. Why do I see it differently? Because the Arabic world, to my mind, has a very important phenomenon. We see Saudi newspapers, we see Lebanon, we see Egypt, we see Syria, we see Morocco, and all the media are at the very high literature, Arabic, the language of Quran, and the person who speaks Arabic can see immediately perspectives of leftists, monarchists, Saudi, Alawi, whatnot. So how does an Arab intellectual in this situation, I'll be honest, I still fail to understand as a Western person, because we don't live in that situation. How do you find a way of what to follow, to find the truth, to get a more truthful vision of the events, let's say adequate vision of the events? I guess the word truthful is not applicable here.
I think you've made the best testimony ever for the Arab press, the miserable Arab press, because as long as all these hidden truths are clear to the public, I think we have no problem. The problem comes more from other kinds of press which are conceived to be objective. And I think what we are talking about is not really freedom of the press, we are talking about objectivity of the press, because freedom is available even in the Arab world now. There's a lot of freedom in the press, but objectivity is what is lacking, whether the press is free or not free. Because the people who make the press, the media in general, are human beings. And as human beings, they are not machines. They cannot be objective in that sense. Sometimes their prejudices are hidden, and sometimes are hidden in the guise of objectivity. And sometimes their prejudices are found out from the first line, and that is where I think there is no danger. I tend to believe more and more that objectivity in the media is an ideal, but like all ideals, it has nothing to do with reality, or it is not realistic. Of course, I don't want to be too sarcastic, but what will the world be without ideals? We need ideals. But I think we should be realistic enough to believe that we can never reach those ideals. It is important to have the ideal there. It is important to thrive and work very hard to reach the ideal. But it is impossible to reach real objectivity in the press. And if we take the example, for instance, of the Arab Spring, of which we were talking this morning, we would find that very clearly in the so-called free, objective press of the West, and how it has changed dramatically over the past 2 years or so, from being euphoric about what has happened in the Arab world and saying, you know, we all remember how the press in the West celebrated these things, and how it has managed through the months and the years to read, as we do now in the New York Times or the Washington Post, very critical articles about the situation in the Arab world. They are treating the same phenomenon, but of course the mood has changed and the prejudice has changed over time. I do not believe that plurality can solve the question, because you may have a lot of newspapers which, as you have defined, some of them would be leftist, some of them would be monarchist or whatever. And the reader unconsciously tends to stick to one type of newspapers that he believes in or that he finds reflects his own ideas. And hence, what the paper would be doing is reinforcing his own prejudices by reading as a communist L'Humanité in France, or as a rightist you read Le Figaro. What you are doing really is that you are reinforcing the ideas of your reader, and the reader, by reading this newspaper, is reinforcing his own ideas. What I think we ought to do is to have this plurality within the same paper. Within the same paper, we should have as diverse a range of opinions as possible in order to allow the traditionally leftist reader who reads his leftist paper to be also exposed very strongly, or as much as we can, to different ideas and different points of view, and just hope that he would reach his own conclusion and not just reinforce his own stereotypes and his own ideas. But otherwise, I don't see that it has to do, our topic has to do with freedom, because you can be free to reinforce your prejudices. It has to do with an ideal that we cannot reach, which is called objectivity. Diversity certainly can help, but it has to be within the same paper and not in a paper that I don't read as a leftist or that my comrade doesn't read as a rightist.
Знаете, мне хочется как бы
договорить. I want to finish what the participants of the discussion are somewhat not uttering, but meaning. So media, you say, are instruments of ideological war, and there is no objectivist freedom that will be distanced from everything and will develop the goal that has a group of terrorists for a government's point of view that controls media within the country. For foreign media will show them as freedom fighters, a crowd that is ruining Cairo or Tripoli. Will be viewed as an uprising of people, and the crowd in the streets of London will be seen as vigilante and marauders. So there is no freedom. There is a fight of projects, and media, journalists are like soldiers in that war. Would you agree with that? Who would want to comment this? Yes, please.
It's a very good point you're making in this distinction between a media operating in what we perceive to be a relatively free and democratic society and media that operates in places which are not. True, I mean, you describe a crowd according to the setting in which it operates. A crowd attacking instruments of government in a dictatorship should not be, I think, regarded as similar to a crowd, say, trying to burn shops down in London a couple of years, or last summer. This point that you're making, the distinction...
какой она должна считаться?
What should it be perceived then?
In a place like London, where you have a real opportunity every 4 years to kick your misbehaving government out and replace it with someone more to your liking, there's no real justification to go on a rampage, I don't think. I mean, this is, again, we're talking about ideals. In an ideal world, we would have a permanent government that does everything to our satisfaction. But it's not the case. Now, I think in a true democracy, as we meet in some places in the West, where the common man or woman on the street can change their government effectively without resorting to riots or violence, it's a different matter than other places where people actually have to take up arms in order to replace their government. So I think the definition of this crowd would by essence, be different.
Не могу не задать еще вопрос, Марио, у меня
I cannot help but ask this question. Eurasian Forum is the place for open discussion for intellectuals, so sorry for this question. I know it will put you in a confused situation, or maybe not. Palestinians, are they freedom fighters or terrorists?
Good question. It's a tough one, which everybody is trying to answer, certainly in where I come from. I can see why they would see themselves as freedom fighters. It's true. I mean, I think you find a lot of Israelis who accept that they deserve this kind of self-determination, which they've been denied forever, basically, from their point of view. It doesn't matter who the denier was. It's Israel for the last 45 odd years. It depends. I think anybody who goes up on a bus full of civilians and blows himself up is a terrorist. It doesn't matter what happens. It can be in London or anywhere. It's a question of what you do to achieve your legitimate rights. I mean, Israel wasn't served its independence on a silver platter. But certainly if you ask the British occupiers of the time, of the 1930s and 40s, I mean, the Israelis did some bad things, but nothing on the scale that you see in other parts of the world. You know, the second intifada, which we experienced in Israel a decade ago, I mean, at the end of the day, I think Palestinians themselves walked away from this because they knew it was counterproductive. I mean, you know, the problem for me as an Israeli, a lot of Israelis have gone out on the streets demonstrating for peace. I personally covered as a reporter over the last few decades demonstrations where about 10% of the population was out on a single town square demonstrating against something. Usually against the government, whether it was in relation to Lebanon and peace protests during the negotiations with Egypt and so on. I rarely see this kind of phenomena elsewhere, you know, demonstrating not against something, whether it's imperialism, Israeli occupation or settlement or whatever, but for something. I really cannot, if you go into newspaper archives anyway, show me these protests saying, I'm not protesting for war or for liberation, I'm protesting for peace. And that could change the atmosphere a lot if this started. I hope I rose to your challenge.
You did. We actually grew up in a country where there were demonstrations for peace, so you didn't surprise us with that question. George, I think you wanted to say something. Then you, and then you.
Yeah, of course you can't have peace without justice. No justice, no peace. It's not good enough to wish for the peace. You have to be prepared to pay the price of peace, which is justice. And neither Israel nor its media has been remotely ready to pay that price for peace. And therefore it's cant and hypocrisy that we've just listened to. But I wanted to pick up the point that our friend from Egypt made about the search for objectivity. Because I want to argue that, at least without disappearing into the philosophical realm, there's no such thing as objectivity. Everything depends on which side of the telescope you're looking through. For example, you yourself, as well as the gentleman from Israel, both referred to yourselves as Western. Now, I've got news for you. The West does not regard you as Western. You have snow on your boots. You're probably still at heart a Bolshevik, and you're still at heart something alien to them. They don't regard you as Western, but you refer to yourself as Western. And for a country in the Middle East to describe itself as Western, of course, speaks volumes. So objectivity is not the point, and neither is newspapers. I'm sorry to break the news to the Press Council of Israel, and even more to the great pillar of writing that is, or at least was, Al-Ahram. Newspapers are dead. Our children don't buy newspapers. And our children and their children will see the end of newspapers. The vast majority of people in the world under the age of 60 are receiving their information online or on television or on radio. And my last point, if I may, I present 10 television programs every month on 2 television stations, one of which has been condemned here, and I need to say this. My television programs on Press TV and on Al Mayadeen TV, I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. Nobody ever on Press TV, Mr. American-Iranian Council, nobody ever on Press TV asked me to say anything or not to say anything. And if every journalist, every broadcaster adopted that point of view, that they will not say what they don't believe, and they will not refuse to say what they do believe, then the media market would be altogether more healthy.
You're assuming that everybody else writes what they don't mean and don't believe. It's a great assumption there.
Well,
Пожалуйста,
Yeah.
господин Амир Ахмади.
okay, thank you.
Please, Mr. Ahmadi.
First, I did not condemn the Press TV. I just simply said Press TV, CNN, Fox, they have a particular point of view, and they expressed that. That doesn't mean that Mr. Callaway, when he goes there, he says wrong things, that it deceives the world. But the Press TV is Press TV, and CNN is CNN. I used to go on Press TV some years ago. At least for the last 5 years, they haven't called me. And I wonder why they don't call me to the Press TV, which is an Iranian TV, and I'm originally from Iran, and they know that I support a lot of what Iran does in the world. It's because my views are more objective, perhaps more independent than the Press TV wants. But let's put it this way. I believe, because this is on the media, I think the media has made tremendous progress over the last several decades. The media used to be a propaganda machine of governments. No more. Media has increasingly have become independent.